Firebombings of Tokyo in March of 1945 killed more than 100,000 civilians, while desperate fighting at Iwo Jima and Okinawa left tens of thousands of U.S. casualties. Truman had to choose between a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland, with military estimates of death tolls in the millions, or to use the atom bombs. U.S. leaders feared the cost of a full-scale invasion of Japan, since the militarists in Tokyo seemed unwilling to surrender on any terms acceptable to the Allies. At Yalta and Potsdam, Stalin agreed to attack Japanese forces in Northeast Asia 3 months after Germany surrendered. Most of Japan's army was stationed on the Asian mainland. Although Soviet military help would greatly reduce America's burden and casualties, Truman feared that if the Red Army joined the war against Japan, it would support communist forces in China. Given this potential problem, Truman chose to use the atomic bomb. Its use could shock Japanese hardliners into surrender, avoid U.S. casualties, and end the war before the Soviets could move into Japan. Furthermore, the use of the bombs would provide a graphic example of U.S. power in the Soviets' backyard. Aside from the attack on Pearl Harbor and some Japanese incendiary bombs carried by balloon over the Pacific Northwest, the U.S. homeland remained unscathed during World War II. The U.S.'s industrial complex had dramatically expanded, its Navy and Air Force were unmatched, and its president and military leaders had sole possession of the atomic bomb. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was devastated, with entire cities leveled and an estimated 28 million citizens dead. Despite the relative strength of the U.S. compared to the USSR, concerns about the spread of communism in the aftermath of war escalated. American leaders framed the contest as a struggle between Western democracy and a global communist conspiracy led by the Soviet Union. The war unleashed dramatic forces of global change and created conditions for a transnational ideological power struggle. The war irreparably altered the colonial empires of European nations and enabled the rise of revolutionary nationalism in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. All over the world, in countries like India and French Indochina, soon to be known as Vietnam, crumbling colonial control fueled nationalist desires and demands for independence, modernization, and higher quality of life. Even before the war ended, boundaries shifted as diverse peoples searched for ideologies and leadership to enable a new phase of their history. U.S. policymakers pejoratively labeled these mostly non-white developing nations and contested regions the, quote, third world, in contrast to the presumed civility and superiority of the first and second nations. The assumed lack of sophistication, cultural development, and national cohesiveness in former colonies prejudiced critical Cold War decision-making in the coming years, often with disastrous results. At the end of the war, America had a clear military and economic advantage over the Soviets. To succeed in the growing Cold War, however, Truman needed another resource, an appealing ideology to counter communist promises that had gained popularity among those disillusioned by the democratic capitalist model. Many people in former colonies of Western powers viewed the capitalism of their colonizers as the cause of depression, war, and fascism. In the coming decades, the selling of American culture and ideology became an important weapon in the Cold War, spreading American ideals through international marketing of everything from jeans and cars to music and movies, provided the, quote, soft power behind hard-edged Cold War foreign policy. There was real reason to fear the expansion of communism. By 1947, alarming statistics about the growing popularity of communism across Europe raised concerns that the Soviets would have the balance of power handed to them by nations reeling from the aftermath of war. Between 1935 and 1945, Communist Party membership increased from 17,000 to 70,000 in Greece, from 28,000 to 750,000 in Czechoslovakia, and from 5,000 to 1.7 million in Italy. Much of this rapid growth stemmed from the key anti-Nazi role played by local communists during the war, rather than from admiration of Stalin's policies. Still, there seemed to be evidence that communism was a powerful force in the post-colonial world. Atomic fears raised the stakes of post-war diplomacy and international relations. The chilling possibility of a nuclear World War III had been hanging in the air since the atomic bombing of Japan. In 1946, dramatic demonstrations of the bomb's destructive power in the Bikini Atoll caused global tension. Very early in the atomic age, fear of nuclear war worked its way into American popular culture. The August 1946 publication and serialization of John Hersey's best-selling Hiroshima brought home the reality of nuclear war. The planning and execution of massive nuclear tests in the South Pacific Bikini Islands during Operation Crossroads received more press than any other event in 1946. Wide media coverage of atomic developments and frightening doomsday scenarios made the consequences of atomic warfare more real for the American public even before the Soviets got the bomb. In 1946, Truman needed a clear policy to respond to both real and perceived changes in the global balance of power in the nuclear age. Inspiration for a critical foreign policy plan came from the Soviet expert George F. Kennan. In 1946, he sent his analysis of the post-war Soviet Union from his post in Moscow to Washington in a widely circulated 8,000-word long telegram. In July 1947, Kennan published an even longer version of his pessimistic assessment of the Soviets in the influential journal Foreign Affairs. Kennan's idea, containment, became the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for the next 4 decades. In the U.S., containment spawned a Red Scare. Fear of communism led to restrictions of individual rights and the systemic persecution of diverse groups of American citizens. A series of disturbing events between 1948 and 1950 accomplished Harry Truman's goal to, quote, scare the hell out of the American public. First, the Soviets caused an international crisis when they blockaded Berlin in hopes of gaining control of the divided city and thwarting U.S. efforts to rebuild a powerful West Germany. Between June 1948 and May 1949, the Soviets, locking down all roads leading to the city, forced the first showdown of the Cold War. The U.S. responded with the most remarkable air supply effort in history. For almost a year, U.S. transport planes carried food and coal into the city 24 hours a day. As they flew low over the city, U.S. pilots, earning the nickname the Candy Bombers, took special pleasure in showering the children of Berlin with candy. The Berlin airlift won the hearts of Berliners and humiliated the Soviets, who reopened the city on May 11, 1949. By then, the U.S. had realized its goal of unifying the western zones of Germany into a pro-Western state in opposition to the Soviet-controlled eastern zones. Policymakers had only a few months to enjoy the success in Berlin as the shocking news arrived on August 29, 1949, that the Soviets had successfully tested an atomic bomb. The Soviets' ability to catch up with American technology so rapidly revealed what U.S. leaders had suspected, that communist spies had successfully infiltrated the Manhattan Project. America's monopoly on atomic power was over. In October 1949, China fell to the communists under the leadership of Mao Zedong. The formation of the Communist People's Republic of China especially disheartened Americans because of their long-standing charitable and missionary aid to the nation and significant diplomatic efforts by General George Marshall to ensure that China would remain free. Marshall spent most of 1946 in China arranging a coalition between the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and his communist rivals, led by Mao. Despite Marshall's efforts, the coalition faltered. Chiang's incompetence contrasted with the communists' rising popularity and superior organization. Full-scale civil war broke out in 1947, and by 1949, Mao led a unified China that allied itself with the Soviet Union.
Russia will never know one day of peace in China. Russia will never own China. China will remain free.
But it wasn't to be. Within weeks of the proclamation of the Chinese Communist state, Mao was off to Moscow to sign a pact with the Soviet Union, and other countries in the West slowly started to recognize the new regime in Peking. For the Kremlin leadership in Moscow, developments in China were a great boost. They now had a great Cold War ally. Mao would protect the long Soviet border with Asia, leaving Moscow free to concentrate its military resources in Europe. Mao, for his part, got the benefit of Soviet economic, diplomatic and military protection, while he established control of his vast country. It didn't take long. The first of the rural 5-year plans was put into force, and the Communist Party bureaucracy took hold of the countryside, transforming society. But more than that, October the 1st, 1949 was the day that set the pattern of superpower politics for a generation.
Americans worried that the new alliance between Stalin and Mao threatened to spread communism more widely in Asia. All these events in 1949 raised U.S. fears and seemed to confirm the basic premise of the Truman Doctrine, that communist revolutionaries threatened freedom around the globe. Any doubts about a world communist conspiracy faded with the news of a communist North Korean invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950.